And there's always the question of what's the relationship or the alignment between what the organization needs and what the people need, what the organization wants to do and what the people want to do. If you get that alignment right, you're likely to get much better production, much higher motivation, much higher morale and excitement from the people who are working in your organization.
This is the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell and Associates, a Newport Beach, California-based ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. The ERP OCJ seeks to share expertise, insight, experience, and research, and to create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success. And now, here's your ERP expert and host, the founder of Nestell and Associates, Dr. Jack Nestell.
Hey, Jack here. Thanks, listeners, for tuning in again for another insightful deep dive. And if you're new to the show, welcome. Let me set up what today's show is all about and why we brought you today's guest. As proposed successful ERP organizational change research has evolved, research is and has also considered the non-technical side of ERP organizational change to understand, for example, how leadership, organizational culture, stakeholder dynamics, team performance and measurement, and diversity might be important to ERP organizational change success. What we do know is that ERP organizational change often requires an organizational reframing. It often requires that organizations consider, evaluate, and sometimes change the way in which they are structured and operate. Furthermore, significant ERP organizational change often requires effective and efficient organization of groups and teams, significant human resource management, management of group dynamics, effective management of politics and building coalitions, and certainly a healthy organizational culture that advocates for positive change. And clearly, the glue that holds all this together is effective leadership. Organizational leadership needs to set organizational mission statements, values, objectives, annual goals, and day-to-day operational support. Moreover, the leadership team also needs to ensure the proper teams, systems, and processes are implemented and executed in a way that is consistent with these missions, values, and goals. And sometimes to do this effectively, it helps to look at the organization through different perspectives and frames. In this episode, we will discuss Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership with Dr. Lee Bolman. Dr. Bolman and his colleague, Dr. Terrence E, are co-authors of Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership, the topic of this episode. Dr. Bolman recently retired from his position as professor and Marion Block, Missouri Chair in Leadership at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. His specialties include leadership, organizational change, organizational theory and behavior, and workplace spirituality. As mentioned, Lee's most recent book, along with his co-author Terry Deal, is Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership. His other books include Reframing the Path to School Leadership, How Great Leaders Think, The Art of Reframing, and Leading with Soul. His books with Joan Gallos include Reframing Academic Leadership and Engagement, Transforming Difficult Relationships at Work. His books have been translated into more than 10 languages, and he has appeared worldwide on topics of leadership, change, and spirituality at work. So let's dive in. Organizations sometimes require a reframing. Sometimes this reframing can or needs to be small, and sometimes it can be large. Sometimes it is out of forced necessity, and sometimes out of choice. Whether it be for survival or to realize most effective organizational performance, as in large-scale ERP organizational change, it is an incredibly valuable idea. When varying and mixed stakeholder groups exist within organizations, employees will have different ideas, perceptions, and understandings of organizational change and performance efforts, which has a direct impact on change acceptance from the employees. But alignment and improved organizational performance often comes through effective reframing. I'm truly humbled and honored for our next guest in his time. While we could spend hours or days picking Dr. Bolman's brain, I'd like to focus today's conversation primarily on a very important topic and on the title of his book, Reframing Organizations. In this episode, we'd like to share some key ideas from their book. Joining us from Brookline, Massachusetts, Lee, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jack, for having me. I appreciate the invitation.
I'm really excited for this conversation and can't wait to share your insight and your book with our listeners. But Lee, first, please tell our listeners more, if you would please further introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay, in college, I thought I was going to be a lawyer, and then I took a course in organizational behavior, and that just changed my whole life. And eventually, I wound up doing graduate work in organizational behavior. I became a management professor, did that for a little more than 50 years. I am now retired, but that means for more than half a century, I've been trying to study organizations, understand leadership, try to develop ideas that are helpful in making sense out of the challenges that managers and leaders face, teaching executives, as a lot of people in MBA programs, and occasionally writing something like Reframing Organizations that Jack mentioned.
Well, thank you, Lee, for that. I appreciate it. So first, we'll start out with a couple of basic questions to get warmed up and get our listeners up to speed a bit. But what does it mean to reframe organizations? Can you explain to our listeners what that means exactly?
Sure. You can reframe almost anything, particularly anything that's complicated or ambiguous. And essentially, it means to look at it from more than one direction or to interpret it in more than one way. We have a favorite story that we have in the book that has to do with, imagine that you're with some friends, you're sitting behind a townhouse in Washington, D.C. on a warm evening, and the cheese is good, the wine is excellent. And all of a sudden, this hooded intruder shows up, pointing a gun at you all and says, your money or I start shooting. So one of the questions is, okay, how do you interpret this situation? And how does your interpretation influence what you do? Well, most of us would panic, and I don't know, I might duck under the table or something. But the host at this event was a wonderfully creative woman with an interesting name called Cha-Cha Rowan. And Cha-Cha turns to the guy with the hood and the gun and says, we were just finishing dinner. Would you like to try some wine? So she pours him some wine. It was a very good French red. And he takes a sip and he says, damn, that's good wine. And she says, oh, take a full glass. And then somebody else says, yeah, take the bottle. And so he takes more wine. He eats some of the cheese. He likes that too. And finally says, I think I came to the wrong house. And he departs. So what happened there was Cha-Cha reframed the situation from, we might all be killed, this is a terrible catastrophe that's going on here. She reframed it to, oh, another guest has arrived. Let's take care of this new guest the way we'd take care of any guest. Offer him wine, offer him cheese, try to make him feel at home, which worked in that situation. And it won't always work, but the basic idea is often the way we're thinking about some situation that we're involved in is not going to help us solve the problem we have at hand. And if we can come up with a different way of thinking or tell a different story about our circumstances, often that'll enable us to see options that we wouldn't have seen before, often more creative, more imaginative options that take us in a much better direction. So that's the basic idea.
Great story and explanation. That helps set the stage for sure. Lee, you would not believe how marked up my copy of your book is. So just want to let you know that in our listeners, I love the book and I reference it often. But I've wondered here, and I guess a couple of quick questions for you. Can you share with our listeners and with me what motivated you to write the Reframing Organizations, Artistry, Choice, and Leadership? And secondly, Lee, I guess I'm curious, why would you choose to include the words artistry and choice in your title?
Sure. Terry Deal, my co-author, likes to say, he's got the most succinct explanation of why we wrote it. He says, it's the book we wrote to survive each other. and so what happened was, this is quite a few years ago, Terry had just finished his doctorate at Stanford. I was teaching at Harvard, and he came to Harvard. And we were put together jointly teaching a course in organizations. It was a big course, 75 people or something in the classroom. And we didn't have very much time to put it together. So basically, we had a syllabus where there was Terry's classes and Lee's classes, and we'd go back and forth. And as soon as we started into the term, it became clear that we had a fairly basic problem, which we did not agree with each other very much. And so Terry would be up giving a lecture, and I'm sitting in the back of the room there, and I'm listening, and I'm thinking, oh, God, this is okay if they don't believe him. But what if they do believe him? These students, it could lead them into terrible trouble if they actually take Terry seriously. What's my responsibility here? So I figured what I needed to do was next time I was up was to correct his biggest errors and then try to move on to what was really true. And so this went back, Terry would return the favor when it was his turn. And this went back and forth for a little while. And we thought it was very exciting. Well, this is really interesting, intellectual debate, academic freedom, all these great stuff. Our students weren't as crazy about it. And pretty soon we had growing rebellion. Basically, what they were feeling was if these clowns can't get their act together, how in the world are we supposed to know what to do? How would you get a good grade in this course when nobody agrees with anybody? And it got worse. One of the high points of this whole thing was a group of about 10 or 15 students showed up in the dean's office to complain about what was going on in our course. And the dean, Paul was his name, called Terry and said, Terry, I got 15 students in my office who say your course is a mess. What the hell is going on? And Terry was very quick. He didn't wait more than a second to say, Paul, very simple, academic freedom. And there was silence at the other end, Paul trying to figure out what does he say to that. And finally, all he could say was, okay. So there's an old principle in social psychology that says one of the best ways to bring a group together is to have a common enemy. So here's Terry and I. We have a common enemy that consists of our students, our boss, and as well as some of our colleagues, because they were hearing complaints from students. And it was a very unifying thing. So we began to wrestle. And what we realized was it wasn't that I was right and he was wrong or vice versa. It was really the old blind man and the elephant story where we were each seeing different parts of the elephant. And each of us was seeing stuff that was valid, that was relevant, that was important, but we weren't seeing the same things. And it took us a while to sort through this to ultimately come up with, well, there's at least 4 different perspectives. Part of why we had these different views was we've been trained not only on opposite coasts, but in different disciplines. I was trained more in psychology and to some degree political science, Terry more in sociology, anthropology. As a result, he brought perspectives, different academic disciplines, and I did as well. And ultimately, we sorted those out into the 4 frames. And we wrote the book because once we figured that part out, then we needed a book in order to teach our course. So that's originally why we wrote it.
Wow. What an interesting and great story, Lee. That's great. And the story on the common enemy, what a successful learning story. That makes me appreciate your book all that much more. And I didn't think that was possible. But what a great academic success story.
The one thing I could add is it helped a lot that Terry and I liked each other. From the start, we really enjoyed one another, and there were things we shared. We both had the same idea that ultimately professional education, we're working with graduate students who are going to go out into the world and try to do stuff, that our job is not just to teach them theory. We really got to connect to practice. And that shared sense of it's always about how can we best help these people really deal with the real world was very much part of what helped us hang together and ultimately come up with a set of ideas about organizations and about leadership that both of us are very committed to.
Wow, what a great story. And that's what's so wonderful about your book is being able to take this research and all of your work and turn it into something that's very practical and applicable. And I really appreciate it for that. So can you tell our listeners a little bit more about reframing research? I know, Lee, that there's a great deal of studies and dissertations, including mine, that use or test reframing concepts. But just from a high level, research is often driven by demand, right? And so why is there such a demand for reframing research, let's call it, and what is its value?
I think essentially it has to do with that there are a number of people who some way or other have become familiar with the framework that we developed, and they think it would help them make sense out of the typical research study, probably the most common version there. This won't cover the whole full range. There's a lot of different studies out there. But the typical study has been an attempt to look at how do leaders frame their world and what difference does that make? And I'll give you just one example. It's a fairly early study done by a woman named Nestell Benjamin. And she was studying new college presidents. And one of the things she found was that for new college presidents, the first year is critical. If you develop support and the campus comes to like you in the first year, life is good. And if the campus decides they don't like you, they think you're the enemy rather than somebody who's going to lead this place in the right direction, you're in deep trouble, and there's a good chance you won't last very long. And one of the things that she found was that many of the people who got themselves into trouble were narrowly structural. They were too bureaucratic. They didn't necessarily realize that about themselves. In many cases, they thought they were more broad gauge than anybody else did. So that there was a real connection. And one of the things that we've found since in a lot of the research is that, we got 4 frames: structure, human resource, political, and symbolic. It's the last 2, the political and the symbolic, that are really critical for leadership. And leaders who understand and know how to leverage the political and symbolic dynamics around them are much more likely to succeed than those who don't. So that's what a lot of the research has been about, but there's a broader range than that.
Sure. Yeah, and fascinating stuff, to be sure. Lee, you'd mentioned in your book, you actually state, I'm going to share a quick quote here with our listeners, that, quote, "An organization's structure represents its best effort to align internal activities with outside pressures and opportunities," end quote. But how do you know if that structure is best? In our world at Nestell & Associates and in private equity, there tends to be a lot of structuring and restructuring. But what are some of the generic issues and challenges in reframing despite the potential benefits?
Of course, the essential question of a structure is how well does it work in the face of the problems that you're running into? What are the big challenges that your group or organization has to solve? And how well does the structure deal with that? Wherever you find that either things are going downhill and they keep going downhill and some of the same problems keep occurring over and over again, it's very likely that there is a structural problem there. And in order to deal with that, let me give you a fairly simple example. It comes out of a case that I often use to introduce structure. It's about a business. It's a Boston office of a financial services firm, and this particular group sells bonds. And they sell bonds to institutional clients, pension funds and banks and insurance companies and so on. And the case is about 10 years old. And they had structured their sales force with a series of what they call generalists. You have each of these salespeople, and each of those people sold the full line of products, but had his or her own client group. They had their own customers. So you've got your own customers, you've got relationships. So it's a real relationship marketing kind of situation. These people were well paid. They had big expense accounts. They could take people to Patriots games and so on. And it was working pretty well, except that the world changed on them. And the particular change was that the products were getting much more complex. This partly had to do with the digital revolution. So the kinds of things they were trying to sell. And it was getting almost impossible for one person to cover the full range. And what that meant was that what the organization was starting to see was the salespeople were focusing on the stuff they knew, but not the more complicated stuff that they didn't know so well. And the more complicated stuff was where the market was best for the firm. So their margins were much better on the complicated stuff. And so they were beginning to lose market share, beginning to become less profitable. And so they asked, okay, what do we do now? Well, ultimately, what they had done is they'd organize these people around customers. Lots of organizations do that. A computer firm might have one division that sells to business and another to education and a third to individual customers. You can organize around customer. That's what they've done. Sometimes that's exactly what you need. In this case, they decided what we really have to do is organize around product. We'll have somebody who specializes in product A and somebody else who specializes in product B, because we know that these products are so complicated that we have to have specialization. And so they did that. Immediately, it created a problem because the relationship marketing part got hard. The customers who used to know exactly who to call, because you always called Bill was your guy, or you always called Laura was your woman. You didn't know whether to call Bill or Laura or somebody else because you had to call the right person for that particular product. So it created problems at that level, but it actually helped them sell more of the stuff that really made money for them. So it made them more profitable. And what that tells you is structure. There is no perfect structure. And the right structure always has to be aligned with what are you trying to do? What's the environment in which you're trying to do it? Let's look at our choices. Do we organize by customer? Do we organize by product? Do we organize by market? There are a lot of different ways in which we can organize. And particularly as organizations get bigger and more complex, often the structure has to get bigger and more complex as well. But it's always, let's try to come up with a structure that enables us to best solve the problems that are most important to us, that are most critical to our ability to be successful.
Great story. Thanks, Lee. And the idea that the world changes and there's really no right structure, meaning I think that we always have to be on our toes, right? And we have to be a bit fluid and dynamic in the way we approach it, especially business.
Right.
And
Right.
that,
There was some very interesting research some years ago that basically, oversimplifying a little bit, said that with structural change, what organizations tend to do, now it depends on the business you're in and how turbulent it is, but they tend to restructure once and then hold on to that structure as long as possible because there are advantages to keeping the structure the same. Every time you make a major restructure, everything goes up in the air, people get confused, people don't know who to talk to, and so on. So there's always a cost to restructuring. But if you keep a structure too long, eventually it gets more and more out of touch. So that restructuring is a little bit like spring cleaning. The mess keeps accumulating, and eventually we say, "Oh, we got to face up to it. There's too much of a mess now." But the other thing that you'll also see, so one of the things that produces restructuring is a change in the environment. Something's changed about our world, and we have to adapt to that change in the world. But the other thing that is also true, and I'm sure many of your listeners know this, is new leadership tends to restructure. Bring in a new CEO, and almost one of the first things that new CEO is likely to do is, we need to restructure. And part of why they do it is because it's a tool that's at hand. It's one of the things that's relatively easy for whoever is in charge to do. So people who've been through multiple CEO changes over the years have pretty much become hardened to, oh God, new CEO, we'll change the structure again. May or may not make things better, but it's what the boss wants.
Right. Yeah, true. Lee, in your book, and I want to share that this is a pretty important, obviously, concepts in your book, but you discuss the ideas of, quote, structural frame, human resource frame, political frame, and symbolic frame. And I think in your answer so far, you kind of briefly alluded to those. But I'd like to spend some time on each one of these, if you wouldn't mind, just over the next 3-4 questions. And so to begin with, can you explain to our listeners, what is the structural frame exactly?
The structural frame is maybe the oldest way of thinking about organizations. It's the rational frame. It's the frame that focuses on, traditionally organizations were depicted in organizational charts, would show a link, a series of boxes that are linked to one another in a hierarchical way. And so the structure is about how we both divide up work. Any group of any size is going to start to divide up work one way or another. But as soon as we start to divide up work, we create the problem of how do we coordinate the different pieces. And so then there's a question of a division of labor on the one hand and integration, coordination on the other. And that's the essence of structure, is figuring those two pieces out for any given situation.
Yeah, two pretty important pieces is division on one hand in the name of effectiveness and efficiency, division of labor, but integration on the other hand so that you can effectively and efficiently work together as an organization. So, Lee, what can the structural frame tell us about teamwork? Or maybe ask another way, anything you can say in general in terms of teamwork and interdependence and maybe how the right structure can improve teamwork and performance?
Sure. Let me give you the example of student teams. I'm teaching a course this term, and I'm part-time. I'm reluctant to give up teaching. And so we have student teams, and they've got some tasks to do. And so they come together, and they have to figure out how they're going to organize. Now, what often happens in student teams is that they're reluctant to structure in any particular way, particularly if it would mean that somebody seems to be more powerful than somebody else. Reluctant to have anybody who vaguely resembles a boss. And so they tend to organize around the principle, everybody will do everything. We'll all do it all. And then whenever we have to make a decision, we'll all gather and talk about what we're going to do. And often that works at one level. Often people feel pretty good about each other and feel pretty good about the team. I've seen this over and over. Problem is it takes huge amounts of time, and often the decisions aren't very good.
Yeah.
They don't make good decisions. And what they could make much better decisions if they were willing to differentiate. Let me just a specific example of that. One of the things these teams often have to do in my course, they have to make a presentation. Somehow we're going to present to the class. And one of the things that they will often do is they figure, well, everybody does everything. So we have to, if we have 5 people, we have to divide our presentation into 5 equal chunks. Each of us will present. You might have one person in your team for whom English is a second language and they struggle to speak in English and they're really scared to death anyway, so they really would prefer not to be up there performing, but they could provide terrific tech support. Well, if you differentiate a little bit, divide up the work and let that one person do tech support rather than insisting everybody has to do everything, immediately you're likely to improve the quality of your product. So that in teams, that whole question of structure, how do we organize this thing? How do we divide the labor up, divide up the task? How do we make sure that we recognize who's good at what, who wants to do what, who doesn't want to do what, and develop a structure around that can make a huge difference in how well a team will work.
And I think that, Lee, just this idea alone and talking about the structural frame and these different structures, and as you'd mentioned, finding that balance between division and integration, and that's probably a 1-hour podcast at least just on that topic. But just to remind our listeners, when we talk about the structural frame, the human resource frame, the political frame, and the symbolic frame, really in part what we're referring to is these different lenses, right? It's a different lenses and different views in which to view organizations, really. So, Lee, that being said, what can you share with our listeners in terms of the human resource frame?
The human resource frame is, I think, the second oldest way of thinking about organizations. And probably there have been versions of it that were around for centuries, but it really began to emerge early, middle 20th century. And, historically, often people who ran or owned organizations figured you hire someone, you pay them to do a job, they should do a job, that's all we need to know. It's as simple as that. And eventually, particularly in the 20th century, you started seeing people saying, well, it's more complicated than that because people are more complicated than that. And there's always the question of what's the relationship or the alignment between what the organization needs and what the people need, what the organization wants to do and what the people want to do. If you get that alignment right, you're likely to get much better production, much higher motivation, much higher morale and excitement from the people who are working in your organization. When the alignment is wrong, the worse the alignment, the less enthusiastic people are likely to be, the less motivated they're likely to be, the less allied with management purposes they're likely to be. So that's the central issue in the human resource frame. How do we understand people and how do we align whatever we're trying to do with the people?
Yeah. And you share in your book too, Lee, when discussing the human resource frame, that many highly successful organizations have gone in another direction, which is, as you described, investing in people on the premise that a highly motivated workforce is a powerful competitive advantage. And, Lee, we know that in ERP organizational change, group and individual diversities in its many forms and the dynamics play an incredibly substantial role in organizational performance and success. But from the perspective of the human resources frame, what can leadership consider in which to align these different views and perspectives? Is there anything we can learn from that particular lens, from the human resource frame?
I think typically leaders in that situation, they almost always know what they're trying to accomplish. They know where they want to go. Almost always, they're going to need people to help them get there. What they don't always think enough about is, what do we need from these people? What kinds of people do we have? What kinds of skills or talents are present in the people or need to be present in the people that are vital for us to be able to accomplish what we want to do? Under what conditions are these people likely to do their best work? Are we aware of that and able to try to create conditions that they're likely to find, this makes sense, the conditions are positive, they're more likely to be motivated? So it's a question of understanding, who are our people? How do they think? What do they want? What will work for them to feel, I am delighted to be here and I really want to give it my best, as opposed to, who the hell are these people? And if you think about
Right.
it, Jack, I don't know if you're a Dilbert fan, a Scott Adams fan. Many managers know Dilbert.
Yep.
And if you look at Dilbert, the basic premise around which Dilbert was built is that managers are stupid and selfish. That's essentially and that they keep doing dumb, selfish things. And fortunately, the people below them often are smarter, like Dilbert himself, often engineers or the basic workers that he aligns with. So this view that, you look at Dilbert, his level of desire, or even better, Dilbert's friend Wally, who goes out of his way to try to undermine the organization. If you don't align things well with the people, they will often become Wallies, and they don't work very hard. They'll try to avoid work as much as possible, and if they can find ways to undermine the boss, they'll do it. So that's the issue that people need to be thinking about.
That's great. So my next question is, what about the political frame? How do you define that, and what's the value there?
Okay, it was much more recently that people began to apply political ideas. There's been a political science discipline for a long time, but they were not applied so much to organizations and particularly to business organizations and so on. But around the 1960s, 70s or so on, you began to see people saying, organizations are political. Well, people who worked in them knew that, but around the world, most people, most of the time, really dislike politics, and they really dislike politicians. And so historically, often in organizations, there's been this sense politics are bad. They shouldn't be here. Let's try to get rid of them. Doesn't work. You can't get rid of them. And you can't get rid of them because you will have politics whenever you have certain basic conditions present in a situation. And those basic conditions are really very simple. One is scarce resources, money, whatever else, whatever resources people would like to have, and there's not enough to go around. You can't satisfy everybody. So scarce resources is the first condition. And the second is individuals or groups who have different ideas about how those resources ought to be distributed. You want more than I think you deserve. I want more than you think I deserve. As soon as you have that, whether the scarce resource is money or a policy decision or some value, whatever it is, as soon as you have that, inevitably you have conflict. Moreover, it's not a conflict in many cases that you could resolve through analysis. The example I always think of is bringing together a group of Catholic priests and Baptist ministers and asking them to come to agreement around papal authority. And you ask, well, is there data or analysis that could help people reach a decision? It's pretty hard to come up with data or analysis that would help people reach a decision because there are fundamental differences between the groups. And whenever you have that circumstance, that kind of difference that is really not a rational problem that you can have a substantive solution to, then power becomes the key resource. Whoever has more power is likely to have more influence over the decision and is likely to be happier with the results that they get. So that's the essence of the political frame. And that means that in organizations, as resources become more scarce, that tends to be particularly true when things are not going well. If profitability is going down, revenues are declining, if there's fewer resources available today than there were yesterday, that's going to produce more conflict. And also, if differences of opinion are increasing, if people are becoming more diverse in their views, if we think about part of all the political polarization and conflict in America, part of what's feeding all that is this increasing gap in people's views of almost everything about government and politics. So people are so divergent that if you look for where's the space in the middle around which people can agree, that space in the middle has virtually disappeared. In Washington, they look for it. Joe Biden, that was part of what he ran for office on, trying to find that space where people, Republicans and Democrats, could come together. He's had a very hard time finding any room there. And so when you have more scarcity and more divergence, you're going to have more conflict. That means that power becomes the key resource, and the name of the game becomes, how do I build power? Because power is often not understood really well. Power in social systems is very simple. It's the ability to make things happen. If you want something to happen and you can get it to happen, you have power. If you want something to happen and you can't get it to happen, you do not have power. If you're working in any situation, you would prefer to be able to make things happen. So you need power in order for that, particularly to the degree that there are political issues at stake, which there often are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what you're saying, Lee, is there is such a thing as good politics. And, we know that power, conflict, and coalition building is inherent in any organization, right? As you just
Right.
alluded to.
Yes.
But I think there is such a thing as good politics and bad politics, and also good motivations and bad motivations. But what can you share in terms of managers as political agents and in his or her role in managing politics? So we know it's there. We know it's inherent. We know that to a certain degree you have to deal with it. We know it can be a positive thing. But if I'm a manager and I'm working at a portfolio company for an organization and I'm in the middle of this, as you had mentioned, these different conflicts and different views and different perspectives and so forth, what's my role? What can I do about it?
Your role, I think, basically, first thing is to be aware of the political dynamics around you and to be good at diagnosing. We often talk about mapping the political terrain. Over and over again, when I've talked to managers about frustrating experiences they've had, the story goes something like, we had this really great idea and we developed this program. It would have been wonderful if we could have got it through, but it got killed by the politics. So that story over and over again.
Right.
And
right.
one of the things I'll ask is, so before you embarked on this thing, did you map the political terrain? And people will look at me as if, what the heck am I talking about? And mapping the political terrain has to do with basically looking at what's the field that I'm going to be playing on and who's going to be on that field? Who are the players who are likely to make a difference about how this thing goes? And where do they stand? Are there some who are potential allies? I better talk to them and try to make sure I get them on board. Are there potential opponents? How am I going to deal with potential opponents? How much power might my potential opponents be able to mobilize? And if I look at where the players are and who's got what kind of power, does this look like it's a fairly easy victory, or does this look like it's a sure loss? There's no way I'm going to win, or it's somewhere in the middle. And if I think about it and develop a strategy that's effective enough. So first is just understanding, what am I up against here politically? What's the political reality that I face? And I find when people don't do that, part of what they often do is they miss some of the key players. They haven't thought broadly enough about who might wind up playing on this field that they hadn't expected, who will get in their way.
Right.
Then secondly is, how do I increase my ability to make a difference here? And that often has to do with its networking, developing relationships with people who could help me, and building coalitions. How can I begin to bring people together who are willing to support this proposition? They may not all agree entirely on exactly what the proposition is about, or they may not have entirely the same interests, but there's enough commonality, there's enough overlap in what you want and what I want that we can work together and we can move in a direction that makes sense for both. And so if I understand what I'm up against and I begin to develop my own base, then often the next step is negotiation. It's beginning to talk to people and say, what do you need? What am I able to do? How can we work together? And hopefully forge agreements. If you go through that kind of thinking process and then that kind of action, having a political agenda, knowing what you're up against, building your power, negotiating as necessary, often that will enable you to get done something that wasn't at all easy to do.
Yeah.
But if you don't see the politics, it's like going into a minefield without knowing where the mines are. There's a good chance something's going to blow up in your face, and it could be a painful experience.
Absolutely. You just touched on this a little bit, Lee, in the previous answer here, but conflict in organizations is a real thing. So just to drill a little bit further, how can you ensure that it's a healthy and productive conflict? If we know it's there, we know there's some politics, we know it can get pretty tough, dealing with the political realm. And I think that part of the point that your book explains is if you understand this political frame, and you can kind of take a step back and reflect, like you said, you understand the players, you understand the playing field, you understand the realities, and you kind of accept it, but you work, on that ball field, let's say. That's half the battle in essence. But anything you can share in terms of how to just ensure that it remains healthy and productive conflict and healthy and productive politics?
Yeah, well, there's no guarantee. And it's hard to protect, particularly against people who play dirty.
Yeah.
Some people will. But a few things that I think are important to keep in mind. One is, don't try to hide politics. Don't drive it underground, because if you drive it underground, it doesn't go away. It just lurks there, and making it invisible often makes it just more insidious and harder to manage. So you want to bring it above ground, make it visible so you can actually address it. A second thing that we recommend is think about creating arenas, places where people come together to talk about the conflict. But when you create these arenas, have a structure around them, have some rules about how the conflict's going to be managed, roles, and referees. And often, if you do that, two parties who are in real disagreement, when they don't really talk to each other, it's like Terry and me when we first started teaching together. If we didn't talk, we could each go on believing I'm right, he's wrong. But often, if you get into the dialogue, you begin to realize, this is more complicated than I thought. And probably the truth is not I'm right, you're wrong. It's somewhere else. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, or maybe it's somewhere else that neither of us had seen yet. There may be a better answer to this than we recognize, but if we talk to each other, we can find that better answer. So part of what I think organizations can do is to try to have, part of what a culture can be about is about what are the rules or values around how we manage conflict and how we play politics. You can't make it go away, but you can try to encourage people to be open about it, to be overt, to deal directly with other people, so that conflict is something that we're aware of, and because the other side of conflict is it's often vital for organizational creativity, for organizational imagination.
Yeah.
A lot of the best ideas and a lot of the new directions come when people fight. And you think we should do this, I think we should do that. Wait a minute, let's fight this thing out. And often we suddenly realize, we never thought about this. There's a great direction we could go that would be a heck of a lot better than what we've been doing. And if you do that, that may be exactly what your business needed to go the next step.
So, Lee, you say to create arenas with roles and rules and referees. Does that happen discreetly and intentionally, or would that be more through leadership example and maybe a little more abstract, or is that both? As a leader in an organization. I'm sorry, Lee. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I think it's often overt and direct. We've got a dispute. Maybe I'm the manager, and I realize that I've got two departments here, and they're fighting with each other, and this fight is getting in the way. And I say, okay, let's bring the key players together. We'll bring them into a room. We'll tell them in advance what we're there to, what's the question we're going to address. We'll tell them what the rules are. Maybe we want to say, here's the evidence we want you to be able to provide. Here's the arguments we want you to be able to make. And so we bring them in, and then maybe I'll serve as the referee, and I'll manage the dialogue, try to make sure that we have, one of the things that often happens is we get into these personal attacks and so on. Personal attacks don't help. What we really want is to attack the problem and the substance, not the people. And if we have someone who makes that clear, and who often it can be the boss or it could be somebody else, maybe you bring in someone with skills in managing conflict to do that if the boss isn't sure she can do it. But you create that arena there, which could be as simple as a room with 8 people in it, and take people through that conversation. And what you hope is that through the conversation, we move this thing forward. Maybe we don't resolve it entirely, but at least we move the conversation forward, and we're closer to having a workable direction.
Great advice and insight. Thank you. So, Lee, what is the symbolic frame?
The symbolic frame basically says the world is not intrinsically meaningful. The world only has meaning as humans give it meaning. And much of what's really important to us is uncertain, it's ambiguous, and we struggle to figure out how do we make sense out of these things. So that's what the symbolic frame is about. It's about how do we give meaning? How do we interpret the world in which we're in? How do we understand our work? How do we understand our organization? That's the essence of the symbolic frame.
So what role does culture play in successful organizational change, and any tactical advice on promoting a strong organizational culture? And does that primarily come through the symbolic frame, or is that more or less, I think I know the answer, I'm just setting up the question, but
Okay.
Is that more through, a strong organizational culture by having the ability to look at the whole environment, the whole organizational environment through these different perspectives. What can you share in terms of organizational culture specifically and taking advantage of these different lenses and these different frames?
Let's start with what culture is. And I think the best way to understand culture is to think of it. This is the way Ed Schein has written about it in his book on organizational culture.
Yeah.
A culture is the accumulated stock of knowledge in a group or an organization. It's accumulated over time. Culture is not an instant coffee kind of thing. You don't make it in 10 seconds. It's a
Right.
time thing. And it's accumulated over time as an organization runs into problems and tries to solve them. And sometimes some things work and other things don't work. And the organization draws lessons. The lessons might be right, they might not be right, but the organization, based on its experience of success and failure and so on, draws lessons about what works for us. What are the values that work for us? What are the beliefs that work for us? What are the ways of doing things that seem to enable us to be successful? And over time, those become embodied in the culture that everybody in the organization imbibes. When you come into the organization, not necessarily explicitly, but in some cases it is explicit, but the organization begins to teach you what our culture is all about. An example that comes to mind is a law firm I worked with some years ago, and they're big now, very big. But one of the stories they tell goes back to when there was the principal and maybe 3 young lawyers, and they were struggling. And their biggest client was a bank in town. So the president of the bank shows up in the office, and he goes through the outer office where the junior guys are, and then he goes into the inner office where the partner is. And after a while, they begin to hear loud voices coming out of this conversation. And they're all wondering, oh, God, what the heck is going on here? This doesn't sound very good. And eventually, the banker storms out. And they can tell he's very angry, and he just goes out in a huff. And so they go into the office to talk to the boss to figure what happened here. And he says, well, it was very simple. He wanted me to do something that I said was wrong. I said, we won't do it. He said, well, then I'll take my business elsewhere. And I said, we'll miss you. And that story stays in that organization. And it's an absolutely fundamental part of their sense of who they are. And what it says is, we'll take integrity over keeping a client any day of the week because that's who we are. We think in the long term, integrity matters more than keeping somebody happy in the moment. And it's through those kinds of events, particularly these marker events, these really events that stand out, that culture evolves. And it takes the form of stories people tell, like the story about the angry banker. It takes the form of the ways of doing things that an organization has evolved. It takes the form often of rituals. If we have a Friday afternoon beer blast or whatever, all of these things become part of the organization's culture. Strong cultures are most likely to evolve in successful organizations. The more success you have, the more success lessons you have to build into your culture. And the organization learns that, these things have worked for us before. We think they'll work for us in the future. Cultures tend to be weak when the organization is not doing well. It seems as if how we're thinking about things or the values or whatever doesn't seem to be working. So the culture begins to be weak. A strong culture is a culture that is widely shared. Anybody in the organization will tell you the same stories about who we are and what we're like. It's widely supported. People in the organization not only know the culture, but they believe in it. In many cases, they revere it. They have a feeling that this culture is sacred, and it is part of my life purpose is to support and help evolve this culture. Weak cultures aren't widely understood. Different people have different ideas about what the place is like, and they're not supported. And so the challenge in trying to strengthen a culture is to both share it, make sure it's shared, make sure more people have a sense about, and that often involves looking for ways to bring people together and explore what the culture is or what's the culture we're trying to evolve and build support for that. So that's the essence. And it takes time. You can't change a culture instantly. If you're a new manager in an organization with an old culture, first, you want to know how strong it is. It's very hard to change strong cultures. They're widely understood, widely supported. It's going to be hard to change that. if you're trying to lead change in an organization with a strong culture, you want to ally with that culture, use that culture as leverage, pull values, beliefs, practices, whatever from that culture, and show how whatever we want to do next, in fact, is just the logical next step. It fits perfectly with our culture. It fits our identity. It's who we are. This is what we should do. If you come into an organization where the culture is a mixed bag, one of the things you can do is look for, well, are there parts of it that'll work for me? I don't have to emphasize everything in that culture, but maybe there's a few pieces of it that are really pretty cool. And let me raise those, make those more visible, and really focus on that version of the culture and that story about who we are. The more successful an organization is, the more you want to build on what you have. The less successful, the more you probably are going to need to reframe. Yeah. And part of what that reframing is all about is trying to figure out what's the problem with the current story that people are telling about this place. How could I come up with a better story, a story that would work better? Sometimes that's by reaching back into history. When Alan Mulally came in as CEO of Ford, Ford was struggling. They had all kinds of difficult times, for one thing, a financial catastrophe. Yeah, right. And they were verging on bankruptcy. And the culture was seriously frayed, not totally weak, because Ford is a very old organization. And he went looking around for, how do I bring people together? He found some magazine ads that Ford had run in the 1920s. And he used those. He said, well, Ford way back in the days of Henry Ford, had values and ways of thinking about who it was that I can bring those forward. I can bring those into a time, almost 100 years later, and those will enable us to go forward. So looking into the history is another way in which sometimes you can strengthen the culture.
Fascinating insight. Wonderful insight, Lee. Thank you. So my next question then is, when it comes to enabling and promoting a healthy culture, what would be the primary role of organizational leadership in terms of viewing reframing organizations from the lenses that we discussed today, the 4 lenses that we shared today? What's your thoughts?
Well, first off, the cultural issue is the first place you want to be thinking is the symbolic frame, because the culture is essentially how we make sense out of the world. And that's what the symbolic frame is about. So you want to look at the symbolic issues there and ask, what are we doing symbolically? Part of what culture is often, Alan Mulally went back to Henry Ford. Henry Ford is a hero in that culture. Yeah. Many organizations have historical figures who have legendary qualities, and bringing those people back is often helpful. You want to look from a human resource point of view. One of the questions is, how well does this culture fit for our people? Does it ask them to do things, and does it ask them to believe things and to value things that really make sense to them? Because in order for the culture to really have the impact we want it to have, folks, we need buy-in. We need our people to really feel as if this culture makes sense. We like this culture. We want to build it rather than fight it. So we need to take on the human resource issues there. The relationship between culture, symbols, and politics is interesting. The weaker the culture, the more likely you'll have divisive politics. Because part of what culture is a system that can bring people together, that can unify, that can give people a sense of shared higher goals. If we have higher goals, you and I may disagree on some of the operational issues day to day or month to month, but if we both share a larger sense of, but we love this organization and overall we want the organization to succeed, that will make it much easier for us to work together, and we can deal with those political issues in the context of the culture that we all support. And then finally, in a sense, structure and culture are both control systems. They just work in different ways. Like if you're trying to get a herd of cattle moving west, the structural approach is you have a bunch of cowpokes riding along beside them, whipping them if they start to diverge from west. You just push them back. You got parameters around them to keep them from going any other way. The cultural approach says, actually, it might be even more powerful just to get each cow thinking west. Because if every cow really wants to go west, all right, you won't need nearly as many cowpokes with whips or whatever to get them heading back in the right direction. But you want the structure and the culture to align, to both channel people to suggest people move in the same directions. And when they're lined up well, you've got a very powerful situation. The only risk is, what if you're wrong? What what if the world's changed on you and the culture that used to work is no longer going to work? What if your definition of how you're going to be successful is no longer as relevant to the world you're in? And so you always need to have somewhere in the back of your mind. It's always good to have at least one naysayer in an organization, one gadfly who from time to time asks questions about, I understand this is how we've always done it, and this is what we're trying to do, but, are we sure this is right? What about X or Y? Could those get in the way?
And that's a good thing, right? There's that particular person, there's a place for them usually in organizations.
I think so, and I think leaders sometimes make a mistake. One of the things I've learned is treasure my critics when I'm teaching.
Right.
When somebody in a classroom starts to speak up in some way critical of whatever it is that I'm doing, first I figure, okay, there's a good chance it could be this is just an individual crank, but often this person is representing more than just herself or himself. There's often other people who have similar concerns, somewhat in the same neighborhood. So if I honor that person, A, I model the idea that we listen to each other and that we're open to influence, which is a good thing. And B, I may learn. It gives me an opportunity to recognize there may be some things that I didn't fully understand, that I hadn't thought through as well as I needed to, and I can actually improve how I handle this because those critics gave me an insight or a new lens.
Yeah.
So treasure your critics.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Lee, it's quite an interesting point that you made that I'll have to think about more. And that was, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I believe you said the healthier the culture, the more the politics potentially. And I would assume that means probably, back to the conversation we had earlier, good and healthy politics, because there is such a thing.
Right. Actually, I was saying that the stronger the culture, the less likely political dynamics are visible. You'll see less overt fighting in organization with a strong culture.
I see. Interesting.
The politics don't go away, but they're likely to be less visible, and they are likely to be healthier because people, in effect, have a shared understanding of the rules of the game, of how we're supposed to operate here. If you and I are playing by different rules, there's a pretty good chance that things are going to get pretty messy and maybe pretty dirty, and that can be tremendously destructive.
And I would imagine that healthy politics tends to be more invisible anyways, right? I mean,
when organizations are growing fast and very profitable and have a strong culture, some of the leading tech firms have tended to have that kind of quality, although their cultures have struggled a little more in recent years, in some cases, some more than others. When they're in that kind of situation, politics tends not to be nearly as visible. Partly that's because scarce resources are not as big a deal. When you're growing and making a lot of money, it's, there's plenty of money to go around. I'd like to have 100,000 go do X or Y. Well, we can do 100,000. That's no problem. Whereas if I really need 10,000 to do X or Y, and there's no way in hell we can find 10,000, that's a really tough situation to be in. And I'm likely to be much more desperate, much more likely to do something a little less productive or a little more underhanded in that situation.
Right. Well, Lee, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm really enjoying this, and I'm sure our listeners are as well. But if you don't mind, I have 2 or 3 more questions I'd love to pick your brain on here.
Sure.
And the next question is, and I know this is a pretty high-level question, I would say, and I think the immediate response is for people to read your book. But what is the first step in learning how to utilize and integrate these frames that you discussed with us today for most effective performance, culture, and change strategy? But what's that kind of first step? What do I need to think as a leader?
Okay. Well, one of the first things that I do with people often is we have this little very short survey, leadership orientations it's called, which gives you a quick self-report of your frame preferences in effect. How much do you think you're structural or HR or whatever? And that is, if you go to my website and go to the tab that says Teaching Reframing, there's both an online version of that, which you can take for free, or there's also a hard copy version, a PDF you can download and do it with a pencil or whatever. And what that does is give you, it kind of introduces the frames. It gives a paragraph on each frame, but gets you thinking about, okay, it turns out I'm very strong on structure and I'm very weak on symbolic. What does that mean for me? And is that okay, or is that maybe a problem? I need to fill out my symbolic scorecard a little more than I have yet. So I think that's very helpful, is just taking a look at myself, trying to get a sense of my own preferences. We've found historically that a fairly high percentage of both the managers and students we run into primarily are operating in the structural and HR frames. They're important, they're good, they're valuable, but they're not enough. Fewer people really understand politics, partly because they don't want to. So many of us just dislike conflict. Conflict makes us scared. It makes us nervous. We don't want to deal with it. We don't like politics. We don't want our son or daughter to marry a politician. And so we tend to avoid it. It's not that we don't know it's there. We kind of do know it's there, but we think it shouldn't be. It's almost like it would be wrong of us to get involved with it. Well, we need to face up to the reality of that. And good leaders understand politics, understand the skills of an effective politician. And finally, the symbolic frame is absolutely critical, particularly the more senior the role you're in, the larger the situation you're trying to deal with, the more people you're trying to bring along in a somewhat similar direction, the more vital the symbolic frame becomes to you. And I've been in more than one situation where I've been with a bunch of people in an organization and give them that little instrument, and they get a score of what frame are they highest in. And it's not unusual, I'll find, that there's only one person in the room who's highest on the symbolic frame, and that's the president or the CEO, whoever is in charge of the place. And it's because when you're in that kind of role, if you don't understand symbols, you're just missing a lot. And the symbolic dimension of your job, you're missing a lot of what you need to understand. But read the book is a great idea.
Highly recommended. Highly recommended. Fantastic book. So, Lita, I want to share.
The one other thing I should say, Jack, is that there's the short version too. In addition to Reframing Organizations, which is a fairly big book, 450 pages. The shorter version, less than half of that, is How Great Leaders Think, Bolman and Deal. It was published about 6-7 years ago. And for practitioners, that's actually probably a better place to start. Although I have to say the 7th edition of Reframing, which just came out about 5 months ago, has a lot of cool, up-to-date cases. You know, our discussion of structure in the Trump White House, for example, you won't find that in any of the earlier books, but it's in the 7th edition.
Got it. And we will be sure for our listeners to include a link to all of the above, absolutely, in our show notes.
Thank you.
No, absolutely. Lee, I want to share a question that you ask in your book, and that is, what do we know about good leadership? If you have to summarize in a paragraph or so, what do we know about good leadership?
Okay. It's a huge question, and it's hugely complicated. And so for one thing we know is that situations matter as well as individuals matter, so that what works in one situation is unlikely to work in another situation. I've often said that if Adolf Hitler had been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, or to a German-American family outside Pittsburgh, we would never have heard of him because he wouldn't have grown up in the circumstances that enabled him to do what he did and to become who he was. The world might have been better off if any of those had happened. So circumstances matter. So that's one thing we understand. So that a key to leadership is being able to bring into any given situation a set of skills and understanding that works in that particular situation. That said, our research says that the symbolic frame, which relates to the ability to tell a story that really is persuasive to people, has to do with, it's the vision thing, the ability to offer a perspective on the future, a view of what's possible going forward. That's vital to leadership. Good leaders are likely to be people who are good storytellers and who are good at offering people a sense of purpose or possibility that they find exciting, worth working toward. So we know that. Another thing that I find over and over again when I look at examples of good leadership is passion. I think great leaders are people who are in love with the work that they're doing and the place that they're doing it and the people that they're doing it with. And that passion and love is contagious. And if I'm passionate, then it's likely the people around me will catch some of that and their passion will begin to increase. And if I don't have any sign of passion, that can be catching as well, and that has different impact. A third thing that I think you see in great leadership over and over is a vital thing is courage. Leadership is often dangerous work. You're often making decisions now that are only going to play out over some period of time. You could be wrong. If you're never wrong, you probably never did anything very interesting. You never took any risks. And if you never take any risks, it's hard to be much of a leader. So the courage to keep going forward, even though I'm not sure this is going to work, I'm not sure people are going to really support it. It could be that I talked everybody into going down this road and it turns out it was the wrong road. All of that is one of the risks of leadership. Even if I'm right, there are likely to be critics. People will tell me I'm wrong. So the ability to recognize all that and say, that's okay, because I'm passionate enough about the work, I'm passionate enough about what we're trying to do, I'm willing to take on those risks. So I think those are some of the characteristics that really are vital to good leadership.
Lee, we could go on for hours, and I really appreciate your time. This has been such a fun conversation. But one last question.
Sure.
If you had to distill your work into 3 or 4 sentences, what would you say to our listeners or to ERP organizational change practitioners or to organizational change practitioners as a final word of advice?
So the key to success is to understand what you're up against. That's principle 1. To understand what you're up against, often you need to think in more complicated ways. You need to have more than one way of thinking about it. You can't reframe if you only have one frame. But if you have more than one story, more than one perspective, then you can bring to bear, you're more likely to appreciate the complexity of what's going on around you. And if you have more than one frame, you're likely to see more possibilities and more options for success. So if you understand your situation, if you understand the complexity, and you see more possibilities and more options, you're much more likely to find something that works. And that, in a sense, all of what we've written and all of the teaching I do and the consulting has been about those things.
Wonderful. Great advice. Lee, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your dedication and your work. And as I'd mentioned, if I'm not one of your biggest fans, I'm not sure who is, but it's such a pleasure to have you join us today. And for our listeners, please check out, and Lee, please correct me if I'm wrong, but newsite.leebolman.com?
Yeah, or if you just do bolman.com, it'll work too. So
got it. Okay. And would that be the best way for our listeners to look you up and get more information, or maybe even get in touch with you?
Absolutely. That'll take it to my website, information on all kinds of stuff on the website.
Fantastic. Well, Lee, thank you again.
Well, yeah. Thank you, Jack. This has been probably even more fun for me than for you. So I've had a great time. So I really appreciate the opportunity to engage in this really fun conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We will be in touch, and take care, my friend.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for joining us for today's episode of the ERP OCJ podcast. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change successes and challenges. We discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change by drawing on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience. We are incredibly grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us in our podcast as we seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community and contribute to its success by bringing research and practice closer together. We want to make sure this is the most useful and insightful ERP podcast you listen to, and we'd love your help in doing so by leaving us feedback and a review. A great place to do so is at Apple Podcasts. Just click on the Listen in Apple Podcasts link, then click Ratings and Reviews, and let us know your thoughts. You can get more info about the show, including show notes and episode highlights for this and all of our episodes, by visiting NestellAssociates.com and clicking the podcast option. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. And don't forget to follow us on social media, #TheERPOCJ. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic week.